being here.
For the witnesses for being here also. Merci également.
Thank you very much to the witnesses for being here. And today we're going to continue with our study on Haiti. And this is meeting number 19 of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights.
Format in conformity with the June 23rd, 2002 order. Members are participating by Zoom and in person. For the benefit of witnesses and members, please allow for you to be recognized before speaking. We have a very good system in this committee, and that works well. But just for the witnesses who are here, that's how we operate. And if you'd like to have interpretation, you can in person use this little thing in front of me for that interpretation for the witnesses. And for those participating by Zoom, just go to the global icon. You can choose French or English as you like. So pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted on April 26, 2002, we're continuing with our study of Haiti. Each witness will have 5 minutes for opening remarks, and then we have a series of questions and exchanges with the members. Aujourd'hui, nous avons fait...
So today we have Frédéric Boiron, who's a sociologist.
And Adrienne Martin.
And then we have Adrienne Martin.
Joining us by Zoom. We also have from Association Québécoise des Organismes de Coopération Internationale, Michel Asselin, who's the Executive Director, also by video conference. So without further ado, we'll start with Monsieur Boiron, here in person. Merci d'être ici avec nous.
Thank you for being here with us. In fact, you have 5 minutes. Thank you. Good morning. So how can we talk about human rights when Haiti is in the 0 year of democracy? Since the fall of the Duvalier regime in 1986, Haiti has had only too short, democratic episodes, too short for democratic culture to take hold. What we're witnessing today is the failure to establish democracy, is the continuation of a dictatorship that does not bear this name. After the fall of the Duvalier regime, Haitians had given themselves a constitution that guaranteed them freedom of expression, justice, freedom of association, the right to education, and the right to life. And yet, we no longer count the number of journalists, activists, judges, lawyers, political opponents, trade unionists, students, opinion leaders, and ordinary citizens who, since 1987, have been forced into exile or executed. But the biggest disappointment for Haitians is surely that their right to vote was stolen. The Chilean diplomat Juan Gabriel Valdez, a member of the Global Leadership Foundation, said that the crisis that Haiti is currently experiencing is the result of a decision that was made by the core group in 2010. This decision is the fabrication of the results of the presidential elections to give power to Michel Martelly of the political group PHTK. This theft of the right to vote was confirmed by Pierre-Louis Aupon, coordinator of the Haitian Electoral Council. Another confirmation, Ricardo Seitenfuss, who was OAS representative in Haiti between 2009 and 2011, said he lost his position because he opposed the falsification of the results. The U.S. Special Envoy Daniel Foote also said that Haiti will never make it if the core group continues to vote in place of Haitians themselves. By putting its lackey in power, the core group has put Haiti under its curatorship. During its entire mandate, Michel Martelly, whom Canada had helped to steal power, did not carry out any elections, and he managed his country by decree. He had received all the necessary help from his sponsors to hand over power to his protégé Jovenel Moïse, who pursued the same policies as Michel Martelly and the same tactics as the Duvalier. Like the Duvalier, like Michel Martelly, like Jovenel Moïse, the current Prime Minister of Haiti, Ariel Henry, was also from the PHTK, runs the country without any counter power balances. The PHTK has made sure it has no opponents, and with its mafia tactics, it has succeeded in silencing the street. As with Duvalier's Tonton Macoute, the PHTK has financed and armed thugs to protect its hold on the country. These are the same scoundrels who turned against the regime and who today have formed themselves into gangs that create a security crisis that feeds a humanitarian, economic, social and health crisis, everything to transform the ideal of a democracy into thuggery. To speak of human rights in Haiti now, Article 149 of the Constitution must be respected. This article states that the person who replaces a president who is unable to fulfill his duties has 90 days to hand over power to elected officials. After more than 17 months in office, Ariel Henry is in fact a usurper of power, a dictator. To speak of human rights in Haiti, there must be state bodies in the country that allow everyone to exercise their citizenship. However, Ariel Henry's regime cannot guarantee even the supply of drinking water, food, health care, allow children to go to school, allow the active population to earn a living without being humiliated. If the rights of women and girls remain a crucial issue, it's mainly because Michel Martelly, who's also a popular singer, has indoctrinated an entire generation with his misogynistic, violent and hateful discourse and his apology for rape. It's to prevent him from spreading his filthy ideology that Canada, the US and France have banned his shows on their respective territories. Haiti is at year zero for its transition to democracy. To get started, a vast programme of popular education will be needed to ensure, among other things, an understanding of the duties and responsibilities that come with citizenship. To get off the ground, we need a renewal of the political class, which today is composed mostly of old, out-of-touch, fossilised, washed-up men who have never known anything other than the Duvalier culture. Pierre-Louis Aupont, the coordinator of the Electoral Council, had added that the deception by which the core group had appointed Michel Martelly as president of Haiti could be realised because nobody had challenged the false results. If Canada and the core group are responsible for this crisis, the Haitian political class in its role as docile and hungry collaborators who have betrayed their compatriots must assume full responsibility for the establishment of this neo-Duvalier dictatorship. In closing, I'd like to remind you that in 2010, when the time came to steal the right to vote from Haitians, Canada, a member of the core group, was the first country to initiate this process and the first to launch this affront to representative democracy. And the one who initiated this assault on a fundamental Canadian value was our then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lawrence Cannon. Since we're in that line of thinking, I deplore the fact that Canada's current Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mélanie Joly, has done everything possible to legitimise Ariel Henry, to make him her sole interlocutor in the search for a solution to the crisis. How can Canada, a country founded on the rule of law, put Ariel Henry, a dictator, at the heart of the solution to a crisis that is depriving Haitians of their fundamental rights? How can we do this? Thank you very much, Boiron. And so now we'll continue with Adrian Martel. And
then we'll conclude after 5 minutes. Madame Martel, please. Sodin.
You're on mute just now. Mr. Chair, members of the subcommittee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify before this committee. My testimony is based on several years of research on the coordination of international aid in Haiti, following different mandates as an assessor of humanitarian reconstruction projects for international organizations working in Haiti. As the country faces a particularly difficult political, economic and humanitarian crisis, and as Canada is questioning its role, I will first share some reflections and lessons learned from recent interventions in Haiti. And in the light of these reflections, I will then secondly make recommendations on the possibilities of a military, political and/or humanitarian intervention in Haiti. So I will start by talking about the impact of, for example, the post-earthquake response, what's happening today and what we can learn from this. Other mentions at previous hearings mentioned that the last 20 years of foreign intervention in Haiti have not prevented what is happening today. I would like to add that the way in which international interventions have been carried out in the past, and particularly in the years following the earthquake, have sometimes had the impact of exacerbating the problems and even weakening both Haitian institutions and certain sectors of civil society, rather than supporting them. And I will briefly share two observations on this. A first observation is that the success of institution building increases when the international community's support is based on a long-term vision and focuses on financial and logistical support. Moreover, expertise in the sector, its coordination and regulation within the country must remain in the hands of the Haitian men and women who work within these institutions. When, on the contrary, the international community's support is provided on the margins of local institutions and authorities, and sometimes in competition with them, as was the case in the health sector in Haiti between 2010 and 2015, these sectors are weakened. A second observation is that Haitian civil society...
Pour l'interprétation en anglais, if you can just go a little bit slower, then we can get that interpretation. Merci.
Oui, bien sûr.
Yes, of course. So a second observation is that Haitian civil society has too often been sidelined, with very significant consequences for the understanding of the issues and the appropriateness of interventions. One of the most notable examples is the fight against sexual violence following the earthquake. The analyses and orientations on how to respond to sexual violence were first taken at that time by the international community without consulting Haitian feminists and women's organizations that are leading the fight against gender-based violence, sexist violence in the country. This has had the impact of making mistaken observations that did not take into account decades of struggles. As a result, the massive influx of international aid to Haiti over the past decade has often had negative impacts on local structures that were already underfunded and also had negative impacts on long-term development initiatives. This leads us to think in the following terms. Rather than asking ourselves whether we should intervene in Haiti, we should rather ask ourselves how we can be allies for the Haitian people who are going through extremely difficult times. This brings me to the second part of my testimony, namely the role of Canada. Given the crisis facing Haiti today, there are at least three possible options for Canada to support Haiti. A military option, as we've been talking about lately, political and/or a humanitarian option. So I close my statement by offering some thoughts on each of these options. First of all, the option of military intervention, as mentioned by several witnesses, is rejected by a part of Haitian civil society. It's also not the solution according to the Quebec member organizations working in Haiti and their Haitian partners. It must be admitted that the international missions of the UN in recent decades and the efforts to reform the security sector, in which Canada has been particularly involved, have not succeeded in bringing the country out of insecurity and avoiding the current crisis. On the contrary, the foreign military presence and impunity faced by the military in cases of sexual abuse or in the integration of cholera have only fueled mistrust and anger. That being said, this does not mean that Canada does not have a role to play, but it is more at the political and humanitarian level. At the political level, as my predecessors just said, there seems to be growing discontent with the foreign governments that are part of the core group, including Canada, which is supporting the government of Ariel Henry, a government that Haitian civil society is openly challenging. A starting point would be listen to Haitian civil society and recognize the Montana Accord for the establishment of a transitional government. Canada's support might also include the fight against impunity, since gangs operate in an environment where impunity reigns. As was suggested in the Concertation pour Haiti, Canada could support an international commission to investigate the assassination of Jovenel Moïse and, more broadly, support Haitian justice in the fight against impunity. Finally, at the humanitarian international solidarity level, there is a long history of solidarity that exists between Canadian solidarity organizations, particularly in Quebec, and Haitian civil society. These organizations work together in areas such as the sovereignty of institutions, whether it comes to sustainable agriculture, strengthening the justice system, education, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and more. This support for civil society is essential, especially during the current crisis, which exacerbates our other primary needs. Madame Martel will have to continue with this during the question and answer period. Thank you very much.
So we'll now move on to Michel Asselin for 5 minutes. Good morning. The Association Québécoise des Organismes de Coopération Internationale brings together 70 Quebec organizations, 34 of which are active in Haiti and have been active for many years, many decades, in fact. We're a member of the Haiti Concertation, a group of Quebec Solidarity and Cooperation organizations and groups from the Haitian diaspora in Quebec. My testimony is based on an analysis of the situation shared with members of the ACOSI, my association, as well as with members of Concertation pour Haïti, and especially with our Haitian partners. Haiti is currently facing the exacerbation of a multidimensional crisis. First, insecurity due to armed gangs. That is growing. The gangs are acting with extreme violence when confronting members of rival groups. Those armed gangs resort to kidnappings and to cruel murders. According to the UN, those gangs are using notably sexual violence as a weapon to terrorize the Haitian population and thus to gain control over the territory. Nearly 100,000 people are currently displaced They have fled the violence that has hit the country since June 2021. At the end of last October, kidnappings, murders, attempted murders of political figures and members of the press made the news. The territories that are controlled by gangs are expanding more and more. There are almost no more neighborhoods, no more regions in and around the capital of Haiti that are not directly or indirectly affected by the actions of armed groups. Another part of the crisis is the explosion in fuel prices. It's increased dramatically. Oil is the only source of energy available in Haiti. There is a severe shortage of gasoline that has also disrupted the water supply, in addition to blocking the entire economy. The Haitian National Police announced on Friday, November 4, that they had regained control of the most important oil terminal, which had been under the control of armed gangs since mid-September. Nevertheless, supply remains problematic, and of course it worsens the crisis. Another part of the crisis is growing food insecurity. It is alarming. According to the UN, 4.7 million people, that is about nearly half of the population, are experiencing high levels of food insecurity. We count close to 20,000 people in the most food insecure phase, and that is a first in the country's recent history. But humanitarian aid is not enough for Haiti. Cooperation organizations know this very well. It is paramount to support Haitians in the production of food that will allow them to subsist, to live, and to plan their future. But right now, this food production is imperiled by the fact that it's hard to get food inputs. Cholera. The lack of access to fuel has caused an acute shortage of drinking water. There's been more than 3 years without any cases of cholera. The United Nations asked countries to come together to help the country because there are 1.4 million people living in the most affected area, despite the appeal for $145 million by the United Nations. Our association held an emergency meeting on Friday, October 14, with member organizations active in Haiti. Several of our partners were present. They gave vibrant testimonials on the living conditions of the Haitian population. And what is important for you to hear today is that all of them are strong in their resolve against an armed intervention on their territory. What they call for is a solution by and for the Haitian people. And that is why our country must not send international forces in Haiti and must convince the United Nations and other countries who would like to see this and to not go ahead with an armed intervention. Thank you very much, Ms. Asselin. We'll be able to hear you again throughout the committee. We're going to start with Mr. Genuis. He will have 7 minutes for questions. Mr. Genuis, floor is yours.
We'll pass it on to Abu Tayyaf.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. Good morning to all. We are facing a multiple-fold crisis that doesn't end in one way or the other. There's the political situation. We have the very, very dire humanitarian, security, economic, food, name it. Anything that Haiti is going through is really heartbreaking. Mr. Boisron was talking about was kind of focusing on the political change that is most needed there. And our last witness, Ms. Asselin, was talking and she said that humanitarian aid is not enough for the country. The question is, what is the low-hanging fruit here? Where can we start to at least have a plan or a roadmap and what would be how can we ensure the effectiveness of NGOs in basically taking on some solutions outside the political solution and the interference in the country from outside? How can we find the conditions to more effective NGOs' role in Haiti? And I'd like to start on that with Ms. Asselin, then move to Mr. Boisron.
Oui, merci pour votre question.
Thank you very much for your question. First, we should support civil society that is trying to organize itself and that has organized itself in extraordinary fashion. Ms. Martel did talk about the Montana Accord. That agreement that was signed back on June 30th, 2021, has been signed by 418 civil organizations, 105 popular organizations, 85 parties and groups, and 313 personalities. So Canada must support this agreement. Why? Because this agreement sets out a proposal for a transitional government. It's important for Canada to support this transitional government, which would be in power for 2 years. They would give themselves 24 months in order to transfer towards free and democratic elections. Already, that group has people that are ready to assure this transition, and there's parity in that group between civil society organization representatives and political parties. So there's been a real effort there. It's a model of consensus, of concerted work. And we know that in Haiti, there are very diametrically opposed point of views. Nevertheless, I hope that Canada will support. It's what our partners are telling us. It's a cry from the heart. We want to find a solution to this democratic crisis, and Canada should listen to the representatives who were party to the Montana Agreement and support them more directly. Of course, I could speak at length of the need to support the Haitian police forces who need resources to accomplish its job. And we need, of course, to support humanitarian aid. We need to increase, in fact, humanitarian aid. We also need to support the international cooperation in general, because when Canada supports this type of cooperation, it supports directly Haitian NGOs. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the key word in your intervention is the roadmap. The government of Haiti has asked Canada, well, the UN has asked Canada to take the leadership with an intervention, military intervention in Haiti. In fact, I believe Canada has already taken that leadership. And the thing is, Canada has not made at this very moment any kind of proposal, any roadmap. So people don't know on what stand we are talking about. So military intervention, of course, I agree with other intervenants on this. Military intervention has never given any kind of positive response, not only in Haiti, in Libya, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. I mean, it's obvious to any of us. But the situation in Haiti right now, we have to agree, is not acceptable. But at the same time, getting rid of gangs is not a solution in itself. It's getting rid of conditions that make people get into gangs. So the roadmap, or whatever Canada has to put as a proposal, has to help for this kind of situation not to happen again. Otherwise, Canada is going to go in with allies for 6 months, and 6 months later, there will be gangs again. So I think the roadmap is what we should be discussing about, not about who can handle it. But at the same time, I'd like to emphasize on what I have said already. There is no government in Haiti right now. There is no government. There is no state of law. So we need to come up with a global solution, not one thing, which would be a military intervention.
Thank you. Ms. Martel, I heard on the answer from Ms. Asselin that she was talking about Montana Accord, and therefore she's kind of mentioning the Canadian role on implementing and working on the Montana Accord. How would you assess Canada's role at the moment as far as Montana Accord and the overall situation there? I would like to hear your viewpoint on this. Thank you.
For 30 seconds.
Oui, parfait. Donc.
Perfect, thank you. So I'll be brief. The two previous witnesses did mention that Canada did not support the Montana Accord. So unfortunately, it's not the angle, if you will, of Canada. Instead, Canada decided to approve a contested government considered legitimate by many. So what we want to see is Canada militate for the transitional government that has been set forth in the Montana Accord, because that is an alternative that was suggested by the Haitian society, an alternative to what we've seen over the last 12 months.
Continue with our second questioner, Monsieur Dubourg, but before that, I'd like to just recognize in the room a number of high school students who came from Experience Canada. I'm really happy that you're here to witness this committee, and hope it's beneficial for you in your future. Monsieur Dubourg, pour 7 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Good morning to all our witnesses. Thank you for being with us to speak about this very, very paramount topic. My first question was to Monsieur Boiron. Mr. Boiron, and of course we read this in the news, you said that Ariel Henry's request was not a request, it was rather a command issued internationally, and you've also said that Canada has already made its mind and decided to intervene in Haiti. Can you explain to us why, in your opinion, even though it's been a month since this request, that Canada has not sent its soldiers in Haiti? Is it because you think that Canada wants to allow Haiti to find a Haitian solution? Well, in response to the first part of your question, is it a request? Is it a demand? Is it a command? Is it an order? Well, in answer to that, I will say that before that Ariel Henry spoke about this, it was the Secretary General of the OEA, of l'OEA, who was the first to say that Haiti needed military aid, and he wanted this to happen. Before that, before Mr. Almagro said this, it was Pamela White who said that as well. Pamela White is the former American ambassador in Haiti. She also said that, in her opinion, we needed military aid. Mr. Almagro made his request on November 3rd, and Ariel Henry followed through on November 4th. And the following Sunday, November 6th, on France 24, the UN Secretary General said that, in fact, that is what was needed, and thus confirmed that he had heard this request passed on by the two other people. Now, I have not said that Canada had accepted. I said that Canada has, in fact, assumed the role of leader on the Haitian question. That is what was asked to Canada, to assume the role of leader.
I just need to look at the different consultations you're holding, such as this one. And I participated in consultation with you, MP Bourassa, and Mr. Trudeau. I had a meeting at the UN on Haiti, and Ms. Joly had various meetings that would lead me to believe that it's quite obvious that Canada has taken this seriously. And I don't think that the Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, would have come to Ottawa to ask Ms. Joly to show leadership if it hadn't been discussed beforehand. So, yes, I am convinced that Canada is already taking a leadership role here, and I think that's good news, because that gives us the opportunity here with the Haitian community in Montreal to have a certain influence on what's happening. Thank you very much, Mr. Boiron. Now, the three witnesses have referred to the Montana Accord, and you've also talked about the core group. Canada's part of the core group. I've got a question for Ms. Martel. We deplore the fact that the core group chose a president or prime minister in Haiti. But now we're talking about the Montana Accord that Canada should support, you're saying. So how should we find our way through this? And as we know, currently in this group, they've made many efforts to come together in the Montana group, but at the same time, they are tearing themselves apart, and Canada has imposed sanctions on 2 members of this group. So what's your view of the situation? Why are you saying that Canada should support Montana? And I'd also like to add something. In the Montana Accord, it talks about a transition, but it doesn't allow us to get out of the crisis. It talks about a transition, government replace the Prime Minister, find a new president, and there you have it, full stop. So how are we going to stop things continuing in the same way, whatever political party comes to power as part of this transition? Ms. Martel, please. Thank you for that question. If there's something that I've learned over the last decade when I've been particularly looking at Haiti, is that the solutions have to be endogenous. They have to come from the community. They have to come from civil society, whether it's a humanitarian level or a political level. These solutions have to emerge from political parties and movements on the spot. We've seen all the aid that's been brought into Haiti over the last decade, but unfortunately there's very little of all that remains, because this hasn't necessarily always been carried out with the correct level of consultation with Haitians. So to come back to the Montana Accord and a political solution, we cannot say the Montana Accord is going to resolve everything, of course, because it's a multifactorial crisis, as we've already said. But we believe that this is the way forward that's been put forward by many civil society organizations in Haiti. So I think it's more legitimate in terms of political solutions rather than supporting a government that obviously does not find consensus in Haiti. Thank you. In your interventions, you did not refer to the corrupt political elite in Haiti, but time is ticking, and I'd like to put a last question to Mr. Boiron. I know that you have written several books talking about democracy and so on, and you said earlier that there needs to be renewal of the political class. So how can we clearly and definitively set up democracy in Haiti? Canada, in its various aid programs, to develop democracy, Canada generally provides assistance for this in various countries around the world. So I think it is necessary to change the rules of the game, because those who are in power in Haiti and those who are leading the country are people of my age, 65, 60, 70 years of age. They've known nothing other than dictatorship. So we have to help to develop a new political class to get the young people taking the reins of power. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So we'll continue now with Mr. Brunel Duceppe for 7 minutes. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for this extremely important study, and I'm proud that it's the bloc that called for this study and created it. Mr. Boiron, yesterday I was in an interview with the Jeunesse Pierre, ACPAM, and one of the points that comes up often is that Canada never presented its excuses for what happened in the past. And it seems to me that that is important for the Haitian community, the fact that these excuses were never presented. We know that Canada has apologized in lots of different files, but first of all, it has to admit that it's made errors so we can get off to a good start. Is it symbolic? No, it's not so important. I think that the crisis is too grave to just talk about symbolic gestures. There's lives at risk. There's people who are being raped, women and girls who are being raped. There's children who are becoming child soldiers. So that's not where we're at. Well, we can look at that afterwards. I prefer us to give thanks rather than apologies. Yes, that's why we're here. That's why we are here to attack the most serious issues. And you have referred to Ms. Julie Mr. Cannon with harsh words, but she is part of the solution, as you've said, and you're happy that Canada is showing this leadership. But what needs to come first? Because we've heard from several witnesses over the last few meetings, and some of them have said that we have to deal with the security crisis first. whether it's with the police forces or with foreign military intervention. Everyone doesn't agree on that, but earlier you said that we have to attack the conditions which are leading to this. So there needs to be more of a humanitarian solution. But stage by stage, what is the first thing that needs to be done? What is most pressing, most urgent? First of all, if we want to get rid of the gang leaders, then I don't think we need to send anyone. I've seen in the news that we're eliminating people from Al-Qaeda who were sitting on their balcony. We don't need to do that. And I see what's happening in Ukraine, and I don't think it's really the Ukrainian army that's winning the war, so they are being aided through intelligence and so on. So I leave it up to the military to comment on all of this. But what I've seen in the news and what I've seen down through history is that we're able to help the Haitian police without necessarily putting boots on the ground in Haiti. I think that's quite obvious. And then when it comes to general assistance, it has to be structural aid that helps the country to get going again so that this type of situation does not reoccur. I have always supported, Mr. Dubourg referred to my books, and I've always supported the idea that the future of Haiti has to go through trade capacity building. If we don't help this country to build up its presence in the global capitalist markets, otherwise it's going to be condemned to live in poverty forever. And there were various projects that have been set up, such as the Petro-Caribe Fund. I think it's Ms. Aslan who referred to that. That was meant to help to develop the agri-food industry in Haiti. So if we develop this agri-food industry, and if all of this money had been dilapidated, then I don't think we would be seeing these levels of poverty that we're currently witnessing. And when people get involved in gangs, when children join gangs, it's because they're too poor. They don't have any future perspectives, future prospects. So there needs to be structural assistance that allows the country to join the global markets. There needs to be trade capacity building. Thank you. I'll continue with you because it's very interesting, your comments. It's very informative, what you're saying. So what's the relationship between the diaspora in Montreal and people who are on the ground in Haiti? Well, you have to bear in mind that 40% of the economy of Haiti depends on transfers from the diaspora. So the Haitian diaspora is extremely important in Canada and elsewhere in the world. It's extremely important when it comes to the direct aid for the economy of the country. So people are very much aware of what's happening in the country. Everybody's got a parent or a friend of a friend who is suffering from insecurity. So everyone's aware of this situation. Everyone is concerned. And I'd like to repeat also that the concerns of the Haitian population in Montreal and the fact that we feel that Canada is taking a leadership role and the fact that we believe that we can have an influence in this community or through a community. We've had lots of different opportunities to meet with you. I'm here today, and there was a meeting with MP Bourassa also. So we would like the community to be included as part of the solution. Do we still have a bit of time? Has Mr. Henry still got some support within the diaspora community in Montreal? I haven't heard any support for Ariel Henry within the diaspora, and I think everyone has understood that the government of Ariel Henry is an illegitimate government. I would say it's not a government. I'd like to point out that whatever solution is adopted, whether it's the Montana Accord or a different solution, since the death of the assassination of President Moïse, whatever situation we actually pursue, it's outside of the Constitution. And now, Ms. Martin, I'd like to turn towards you. Currently, it's an urgent situation. I'd really like to underline that when we're talking about Haiti. What's the role of international cooperation organizations, according to you, given the current crisis that we're experiencing? First of all, We have to learn from our mistakes of the past and make sure that the aid that is granted is part of a long-term vision in terms of the needs of the population, and that it's matched up where possible with initiatives that were already on the spot in Haiti. Because there's many Quebec organizations that have been in Haiti for years, and by working and reinforcing the programs that have already been set up, then I believe that's when we'll really have an opportunity to be efficient in granting assistance and really meet the needs of the population, because these partners and partnerships have already been established with Haitian organizations. Thank you very much.
Monsieur Boudinel-Duceppe. We'll continue with Ms. McPherson for 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and it's a great pleasure for me to have our witnesses with us today. Thank you for your testimony. I've had the privilege and the pleasure of working with both Ms. Martel and Ms. Aslan in my previous life before I was elected. Ms. Martel, I'm going to start with you if I could, and I'm very interested in how you're talking about that humanitarian response, what that humanitarian response should look like, because of course every one of us is horrified about what we are seeing in Haiti right now, and trying to find those ways to move to provide the support in the most effective way possible. You know, hearing things like half the population is food insecure, hearing things that all of the things that you've said about needing to be Indigenous solutions, long-term predictable funding, are we finding ourselves in a situation because the responses that the international community have provided to Haiti in the past have not been Indigenous-led, they have not been long-term and predictable, working with civil society? Is that why we're here? And is there a risk that will happen again, that we will provide a Band-Aid system of development?
Well, the situation today is not necessarily caused by the way in which development aid has been granted in the past. It's much more complicated than that, but the way in which it's coordinated and the way in which the development agenda is set in an emergency situation, unfortunately, has long-term negative impacts for development projects that have been in the country for a long time. We've seen that in the past. We've seen what's happened after the earthquake. Aid arrived in a massive way without any coordination with Haitian bodies, which meant that the priorities weren't set up by Haitian actors. We've seen that also with the UN and with lots of different coordination bodies. And unfortunately, the effect was to actually weaken society because they came and looked for Haitian expertise too late. So when it comes to emergency situations, we shouldn't always turn to international humanitarian actors. We think that they're the ones who have the expertise, but that's what I'm questioning. Because even if we're in an emergency situation with food insecurity, we need to have Haitian-led local solutions. There are CSOs that are specialized on these questions. They're specialized in emergency aid, and we should listen to them first and have partnerships with them together with Canadian NGOs, for example.
And so perhaps then something that we could say, or that we could say as a committee, and one of our recommendations is that now going forward, our development aid needs to be increased. It needs to be long-term and predictable. It needs to engage with civil society and Haitian communities. So that's how Canada should be looking at providing our aid. Now, you talked a little bit about the UN coming in and doing this work. Do you think a UN mission at this point, if it was given a very strict mandate, if it was given some very strict guardrails, would be an appropriate response at the moment if it then did use the ingenuity and the local expertise?
If the UN, well, here we're talking about a humanitarian intervention, so there's different UN agencies. If they played a more active role, as was the case rather than what happened in the last decade. Well, the UN has had humanitarian aid coordination roles in different sectors, for example, the food sector, water, sanitation, health. So if the UN decides to play that sort of role, there needs to be co-leadership together with the population Haiti and also with the National Directorate for Water and the national health authorities. That hasn't happened in the past. We need to make sure that there is coordination of aid and that we actually do capacity building and reinforce the leadership of Haitian institutions.
Ms. Martel, Ms. Aslan, you had spoken a little bit about the Montana Accord, quite a bit about the Montana Accord, and I know that there's a lot. You have a great deal of information representing so many organizations that work in Haiti. We know that not all Haitians support the Montana Accord. There is this risk that this is another, or that this could be a divisive thing to be supporting of, or that there are some people that are supporting it publicly, but perhaps not behind closed doors. Can you talk a little bit more about the Montana Accord and Canada's role with regards to moving forward on the Montana Accord, please?
Well, what we're hearing from our Haitian partners is that there's a far bigger risk that if Canada continues to work with an illegitimate government, then Canada may actually stretch out the democratic crisis, because there is strong consensus, and we've said that this morning, around the fact that we don't think that the current government is legitimate to sort out the crisis. Well, there is an immediate humanitarian crisis, and the UN is already on the spot dealing with cholera, and the FAO is also granting support with the major food crisis. But there's also a democratic crisis at large, and that really is the keystone to all of this. We think that we need to work with the Montana Accord. It's not going to be perfect. There will still be debates and discussions, of course, but what we're going to do, we're going to continue to support an illegitimate government that's still not ready to go towards elections. And in fact, here we have a strong consensus that was renewed again in January, and which is proposing a governance structure, which is a very interesting one. A governance structure by state with representatives of civil society, with women's groups and also churches involved, and with political party parity, with a real rainbow of political parties involved. Because the whole Montana group knows that we have to build up consensus to make it. And of course, there is objective not to remain in power. There's a written commitment which has been signed and which has been rendered public that they have 2 years to set up elections. And we believe that the Canadian government should support this agreement, meet with those leaders and see with them how to do this, rather than supporting a government that's totally illegitimate. You have to bear that risk in mind as well. Thank you.
For 5 minutes to Ms. Vanderbilt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for your testimony. I'd like to start my first question to Ms. Martel, and I want to pick up on what you were saying about the fact that whatever we do, we need to be listening to Haitian feminists and to civil society in Haiti. So my question to you is, and I know that you mentioned the sexual violence in the context of international forces, and it sounds like you were saying that the women in Haiti are not asking for an international force. So it's more along the humanitarian lines. And you know that Canada is the second largest humanitarian donor to Haiti after the United States. And we also just contributed $10 million to the UNDP Basket Fund, which is specifically on building capacity of the police and security forces. Is this the right direction? Should we continue on the humanitarian side on building up the capacity of Haitian authorities to be able to bring back law and order? Is that what the women in Haiti are asking for, as opposed to an international force?
Thank you for that question. First of all, I don't want to speak on behalf of Haitian feminists. They've got their own struggle, and they present that publicly. But I would like to answer by saying the following. For example, civil society groups, including women's groups, who are part of those who are challenging the system today, they're the ones who have mobilized themselves a great deal when there were cases of sexual assault. So it's Haitian women's groups who really denounced this, who talked about the situation and called out the impunity around the soldiers that were sent back home and did not undergo justice in Haiti. So that's why the idea of having an international military intervention such as the one that we've had in the past is something that these people believe really is not the solution given the situation with sexual violence. There are certain organizations that exist in Haiti who've been working on this for decades. The women's movement in Haiti is one of the biggest movements that really spoke out against dictatorship and really mobilized. It's very solid. The women's movement is very solid in Haiti. They're working on women's health and against domestic violence. And unfortunately, the last times when the international community intervened, we didn't take account of their expertise. And we hope it will be different today because there's lots of sexual violence cases that have been mentioned by Ms. Aslan earlier. And we need to work with these women's organizations because they know how to respond and what to do in the current situation to support the victims and survivors. I hope I've answered your question.
That is the essence of our international feminist international assistance policy, to make sure that we are listening to the expertise of local women. My second question is for Madame Aslan, and it's specifically around you were talking about the gangs and the violence by the gangs, and we've heard in this committee from a children's rights advocate in Haiti, we've heard that the gangs are also made up of victims. They are children who have been forcibly separated from their families, who are then recruited into these gangs. And so they're victims too. So I guess my question to you is, what do we do about that? Because obviously the answers are not simple when the very people committing the violence are victims themselves.
Yes, it's a very complicated question. And Asian partners with whom we're working have told us. We know the heads, the leaders of the gangs, and the big question is the fact that there's arms, there's weapons coming into Haiti. That's why they're armed gangs. So we have to control our borders, stop this at the border, because there's big transfer of weapons coming from Miami, amongst others, and that is really shocking organizations a great deal. They want us to act on that end, because if there's less weapons or no weapons coming in, then we would cut off the supply and we would stop this explosion of gang violence. That is why we think that we don't need to go for military intervention, but we need to back up, reinforce the Haitian police force. We'd started to do this. Canada had carried out training of police officers in Haiti, and we need to really redouble efforts and support them so they can play the correct role and stop those who are responsible for all of this, because the impunity at the moment is just reinforcing their power. And we also have to look after the victims by dealing with the poverty issue. We're doing it through education. But, you know, it's very difficult to go back to school currently because the roads are blocked. It's too dangerous. So if we cannot support a political transition, if we do not support the police forces to play their role, because, of course, they're under threat themselves, it's not simple at all. Thank you. We continue with that.
The questioner, Mr. Jennis, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair. It's excuse me. It's great for me to be back visiting this committee. I wanted to start by asking any or all of the witnesses just about these armed gangs themselves. What do we know about possible motivations, political motivations, or otherwise? Do they have specific goals they want to achieve? Are they organizationally sophisticated, or are they chaotic? What's going on in terms of what the gangs are organizationally like and what they're trying to achieve?
May I?
Yes, please.
Yes, I'd like to answer that question by saying that what we're seeing in Haiti right now is a civil war, and the gang, one of the gang, which is named Mouvement Révolutionnaire G9, Mouvement Révolutionnaire G9, their objective is to overthrow the government. in the past months, they had, in the first place, asked for seats on the government of Ariel Henry. But since the beginning, their idea was to overthrow the government. Of course, there is, ransom, kidnapping against money and stuff. But the main objective of that group, which was sanctioned by the UN and by Canada, Jimmy Cherizier, their main objective is to overthrow the government. And I'd like to make sure that we all understand that, because what we're seeing in Haiti is war crime. It's crime against humanity, but also war crime. If we don't put that into the equation, we're going to miss on a lot of things going on in that country right now.
Can I just...
Yes, please.
Sorry, can I just probe that point? So you mentioned one gang that it sounds to me that maybe understanding it as a rebel force is maybe a more useful frame for just us understanding it. But is that representative of the various gangs, or do you have this gang that's trying to overthrow the government and others that are simply trying to simply using criminal means to enrich themselves with no specific political goals, or do they all have some kinds of political goals?
The one that we talk most about is G9, G9 en Famille, Mouvement Révolutionnaire, and the senator that was one of the senators that was sanctioned by Canada, which is Joseph Lambert, he had said at one point, if ever we want to dismantle the gangs, we also have to keep in mind there are some of them who are revolutionary gangs. And that idea of saying that, I have said previously in my speech that the actual political class in Haiti has transformed that country into a voyoucracy. This is what I mean. I mean, this idea, this ideology of criminal actions in Haiti come from the top to the bottom. And keep in mind that what we're seeing in Haiti right now is war crime and war against humanity.
Right. Okay. So our frame needs to understand, I'm getting the impression that we have one sort of prominent revolutionary gang as well as some, purely criminal gangs as well. Is that correct?
Yes, you're correct.
Okay, thank you. And I'm assuming then you'd have very different motivations for people joining these different gangs depending on whether what objectives they're motivated by.
Yes, but I just want to emphasize that their definition of revolutionary is not the way I see a revolution, right?
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that those are criminals still, not people who want the good for their country.
So I have a very negative association with the idea of revolution in general. So, thank you for helping to clarify that distinction. If I have time for this, just a longer term consideration. Prior to this conflict, I spoke with a lot of people who had concerns about just the challenges in attracting foreign investment and into Haiti, saying that there's so many people willing to give development assistance but not willing to actually invest and try to build businesses and create jobs in Haiti. Is this a long-term challenge? How can we encourage more economic growth through investment as coming alongside development assistance as a tool for building up the country?
In 10 seconds.
We agree on this. If we want to work on trade capacity building, security has to be the first item that we have to solve. Yeah. Why would you invest in a country where you might lose all your investment because of gangs?
Yeah.
Thank you. And we'll continue on with Monsieur Brunel Duceppe for 5 minutes.
5 minutes for Mr. Brunel Duceppe. Thank you. It's a very interesting panel. Thank you very much. This is really going to help us drafting the report and will help our analysts who are taking note of all this. Ms. Asselin, I've got a question to put to you. I think that you're aware of this. What's happening on the ground in terms of the security of humanitarian workers? We don't hear much about this, and I think it's important for you to fill us in on that, please. Well, for several years now, through Quebec Cooperation, we've developed support for workers through our project, so there's very few humanitarian workers through Quebec Cooperation who are on the ground. Unfortunately, it's very difficult for us to go there. We can't really organize missions because it's very difficult for our partners to welcome us. They're already under threat themselves. There's lots of different security rules that apply, in particular when it comes to travel. And we would need to travel with humanitarian material. And then there's a question of agriculture. There's lots of big challenges because, in fact, we have to go for alternative forms of transport, for example, with small planes, because we're not able to move from one region to another. And it's a very concerning situation. But what's impressive to see is that when we have meetings, and now thanks to modern technology and with Zoom, we're able to talk with our partners on the ground on a regular basis, and we see they're continuing with their work. There's 100,000 people who are displaced out in the countryside, in their displaced from their places of origin. That's why there's this big food crisis, because even the farmers, male and female farmers, are displaced because there's big capacities in agriculture in Haiti, but they don't have what they need to be able to continue with their production. And because of insecurity, it's a threat to everyone in Haiti, including the staff from all of the different organizations with whom we work. On the humanitarian side, there are big NGOs on the ground to fight against cholera, for example. I can't go into all of that now, but I think these are organizations that have big resources, such as the UN, and they're the ones organizing this immediate response to the cholera outbreak and the humanitarian crisis. But there we're going to distribute food, but that's very much in the short term. We're concerned because we want there to be security offered to farmers so that they can actually meet the needs of the population on the ground. They're capable of doing that, but they have to have the right inputs and be able to do that in a safe way, and they have to be able to circulate around the country. So when you've got humanitarian workers in Haiti, sometimes just to have access to the population, do these workers have to negotiate with gang leaders, for example? Do they have to give bribes to get access to certain parts of the territory? Are you not aware of that? Well, I don't know the details on that, but I can tell you that when there's no fuel, everyone has to buy fuel on the black market then. Everyone, including the Global Affairs Canada people, because there's no fuel anywhere otherwise. So it's a major crisis underway. And then there's the question of influencing gangs. No, in the reports, or rather in the relationships with our NGOs, they do not work with gangs. But yes, there is a street market, a black market that exists to meet essential needs, especially fuel, because that's the only energy source on the island. So it really is not a simple situation. Thank you very much, Ms. Asselin. I've just got 1 minute, but I'd like to turn to Mr. Boiron. You have talked about civil war. I think that's the first time we've heard that term here in the committee. I'd like you to develop that further, because that would be interesting for us when drafting the report. Most of the gangs from the outset wanted to overthrow the Moise government, and then afterwards they always said that they wanted to overthrow the government of Ariel Henry. So what I'm saying here, well, is known. They publish videos on this where they say that they want to overthrow the government, including Jimmy Cherizier. And in the Nouvelliste newspaper, there was an article that was published where the gangs actually put down their claims for the government. They said they were going to propose a transition government or a transition roadmap. Well, that's astonishing. And Montana was not part of that. They said they were going to be the transition. And all of this is documented. No worries there. It is a civil war because the objective is to overthrow the current government. So, thank you very much.
With Ms. McPherson for 5 minutes. We can't hear you, Ms. McPherson.
Is that better?
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry about that. No, I was just saying thank you again to the witnesses for their testimony. This will be very helpful for us as we put forward recommendations. Mr. Boisronde, I had some questions for you. Some of the things that you were speaking about, the ways that we need to get sort of a level of order in Haiti before we can do those next pieces of the development and the democracy process. One of the things that you talked about was the education for Haitians on democracy. And we know right now in Haiti that media is being attacked, journalists have been murdered, that there is no capacity for the media to do that. Is that a role that you see countries like Canada playing? Could Canada step in and be part of that portion of the solution? Could we be providing those supports?
Been asking for that for many years, that that Canada be part, and I have talked about it with Mr. Carrière, the ambassador in Haiti, that what Haiti need right now is popular education on democracy. We went overnight from a dictatorship to democracy, which ended up, in fact, with only one real power that the people had, which was the power to vote, the right to vote, which was stolen right away, right off the bat. That was stolen. People in Haiti have no idea what living in a democracy is, because they've lived in it for, at least right now, almost 60 years. I am 65 years old. I was born in 1958, the year Duvalier came to power. So anybody of my age has only known dictatorship, only a few episodes of democracy. So this is a country where people have never been exposed to what democracy is. And I encourage Canada, and I'm asking one more time, that we help popular education on democracy, not only for the political class, for the regular citizen to understand what is right, what are the responsibilities. Democracy is built on, the trust that we have in each other. When you've been living for 65 years in a country where you don't know who you can trust, this is living in a dictatorship. Dictatorship is not only a structure, it's a culture. And if we don't help Haitians get rid of that culture, we are only going to see this going over and over again.
Well said. Thank you very much for that. The other thing I think we know that needs to happen in Haiti right now is that we do need to stop the gang violence, stop the violence, so that some of these things can move forward. We have sanctioned, the Canadian government has sanctioned some Haitians. Do you think there's a need to increase that list of sanctions? Should we be doing more to using that tool, those tools of sanctioning individuals, not countries, of course, but individuals? Would that be useful?
Yes, it will be useful. And I hope this list is you're gonna put some more names on the list. And this is going to send a straight message to the political class, the business class also, that things that were done in that country, that, in fact, putting people on the list is a message to Canadians, to tell Canadians that Canada is not ready to deal with criminals, is not ready to deal with some people who are keeping Haitians in poverty, in terror. This is a message to Canada. This is a message to ourselves. What are we Canadians ready to do? Not only to help Haitians, but also to protect our image as a country. Are we ready to make that change? I hope the list is going to go up.
Okay. And I would say, too, I know I don't have very much time, but the list is important. The enforcement is, of course, more important. And I always do wonder if the enforcement is as strong as it needs to be. So I'll promise you that I will continue to push on that end from my side. Mr. Chair, I believe I'm done.
Exactly. But thank you, Ms. McPherson. And you timed yourself amazingly. We'll now continue with Mr. Assassi for 5 minutes. Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Allow me to start off by thanking all three of our witnesses for their expertise and their insights. This has been a really, really valuable session we've had. So as all three of them have made abundantly clear, we're watching a confluence of crises going on in Haiti. The one that really breaks anyone's heart is conditions on the ground in Haiti itself. As I understand, all the banks and the schools and the hospitals, many of them are closed. So if I could start off with Ms. Aslan, how do we fortify the efforts of organizations on the ground in Haiti so they can do a better job doing what they're there to do? As you know, conditions are very chaotic. What do we do as a country to lend them a helping hand to stabilize the situation?
Well, I'll repeat what Ms. Martel said before me, and something that we see every day on the ground. We need to reinforce Canadian cooperation, but also do it in a flexible way, because the financing that we get from global affairs has to be adapted to the reality, which is ever-changing. We've got programs to send out volunteers, for example, and we've got medium and long-term programs that stretch over 7 years, and it's very good to have these longer-term programs. But the current cooperation programs underway in Haiti have to be very flexible so that they can adapt in terms of the current situation. And that's not always easy for a big machine.
Ms. Aslan, what I'm talking about capacity building on the ground. So how do we do that to ensure that they have the capacity, all those organizations that may be on the ground in Haiti?
Well, that's what I was trying to answer. Perhaps I didn't answer correctly, but there is Canadian assistance that's already in place. We can do more, but in order for this aid to be as efficient as possible, then we have to work with NGOs in all the different areas: health, education, justice, agriculture. And we have to meet the needs quickly. And that's what's important, to be flexible. We're having discussions with Global Affairs to try and find solutions to this. And as I was saying, I'll repeat once again, we have to support the police, the Haitian police force, to guarantee a certain level of security. We need to act on that front as a Canadian government.
Thank you very much. Now, if I could go to Mr. Boisseron. I have also found your testimony very, very compelling, especially what little faith you have in the old political elites. You seem to have much greater confidence in younger Haitians who are obviously on the ground and familiar with all the challenges. What do we do to support younger leaders in Haiti to make sure that we can move forward?
Let's work with them. Let's work with them. Let's invite them. I was listening to those two senators that were sanctioned by Canada, and they was kind of surprised because they said, well, they've always been allied of Canada. They were invited by the government of Canada, by the government of Quebec. Maybe Canada should start inviting younger leaders in Haiti, have some leadership school, help them build their leadership through some programs. I think this would be very helpful.
Absolutely. You have certainly highlighted that dynamic. I understand I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You have 30 seconds, but up to you.
I will concede my 30 seconds. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Assassi. And we'll continue on to Mr. Jenis for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Chair. There may be a little bit of background noise where I am, so I'll mute myself in between asking the questions. I wonder if our witnesses could share a bit about how, in particular, Canada could build security capacity. What what steps that we can take to support the development of strong armed forces, police forces that are able to provide Haitians with the security they need over the long term.
So, there's a sociologist in Haiti, her name is Michelle Auriol. She said one of the real big problem of the police, the national police in Haiti, is not necessarily the material that they have. She said the recruitment of the police in Haiti is part of the failure of this organization. The people that are recruit for the police don't have the capacity to, from the beginning, from off the bat, they don't have the capacity to accomplish the work itself. And another thing that I think is important, the salary that is paid to a policeman or woman in Haiti at this very moment that we're talking is about $325 Canadian a month. I mean, this put the police in itself very open to corruption. In fact, Barbecue, Jimmy Cherizier, is an ex-policeman. There's many of the people who are in the gangs or the gang leaders were policemen. Why? First, they weren't prepared for that very sensitive position. And second, they are underpaid. And third, they don't know, even if you train them, they might not have the capacity from the beginning to absorb the training. So, then again, this must be considered in the solution. How do we hire? How do we train? And how do we pay?
Just building on that, and I'd love to bring in some of the other witnesses as well. I think in some countries, think of Georgia, Ukraine, at points in the past, they pursued very dramatic police reform programs. It was explained by a previous Georgian ambassador to me that basically they realized that the existing police were doing more harm than good, and so they fired them all and replaced with a whole new group. Is this a point in time? And I'm not suggesting to be too specific, but are there things we can learn from those models? Is now a time for a kind of a dramatic reform of the security apparatus in Haiti? Please.
I would like to leave room to the other two witnesses if they want to take the floor on this. But still, what I'm saying is that whatever it is, we need the police in Haiti need a reform, because there's a small army in the country which is not relevant in the solution. So the solution which was picked by Canada and the international community is to work with the police. Actually, what I'm saying is the police is too weak to be part of the solution the way it is. In fact, what we're seeing now is the failure of the police in itself. So whatever the situation, whatever the solution that is going to be picked, the police has to be reformed under the three elements that I mentioned: recruitment, salary, and equipment, of course.
Thank you. Let's bring in the other.
And
witness.
we have a last minute, then we'll conclude our panel. Please, 1 minute, Mr. Genis.
Yeah, I'm very curious for the reflections of the other witnesses. Go ahead, please.
OK, je vais y aller brièvement pour laisser Michel. Donc,
So I'd just like to say that Canada has been involved in the security reform for a long time. The mandate has evolved. It was perhaps a more comprehensive vision before, and then it turned towards technical assistance or training, technical training. So we have to think about not just arming or training the police, but we need to fight against impunity and reinforce the judicial system, because how can you motivate the police to do their work correctly if there's impunity? All of it has to hang together and be dovetailed. Yes, you can continue for 15 seconds. Yes, I have the same ideas. I think that we have to meet with groups dealing with justice and the judiciary system and those who are defending human rights to discuss that subject. And I have the same feelings as Mr. Boiron and Ms. Martel.
For being here, the witnesses today, for being in person and online. A sincere thank you for your testimony. It will be reflected in our work. We have hand clapping on Zoom. And again, thank you for being here. For the members, we're going to move into a closed session. We'll ask those who aren't part of the committee to allow us to have a closed session meeting. And those online, please do go as swiftly as you can to that closed session link. Merci beaucoup. In a few moments, we'll be together.